In the summer of 1944, the American advance across France came to a halt. Not because of the Germans, but because the tanks ran out of fuel. The Army was saved by the Red Ball Express, a nonstop convoy driven by exhausted soldiers, nearly 3/4 of them black men who had been denied combat roles. To understand why they mattered, you have to go back to the beaches of Normandy. In June of 1944, the Allies had landed in France, and after weeks of brutal fighting in the hedgerows, they finally broke out into open country. What followed was one of the fastest advances of the entire war. American armies, including the Third Army under General George Patton, tore eastward across France, chasing a retreating German enemy, sometimes covering as much as 75 miles in a single day. It was a stunning success. It was also a catastrophe waiting to happen, because an army that moves that fast has a hidden weakness that no amount of courage can fix. Every mile it advances is another mile that its food, its ammunition, and above all its fuel has to travel to reach it. And the supply situation the Allies faced was close to a nightmare. In the months before the landings, to keep the Germans from rushing reinforcements to Normandy, the Allies had bombed the French railway network into ruins. Now those same wrecked railways were desperately needed, and they were gone. The great cargo ports that could have unloaded mountains of supplies like Le Havre and Antwerp were still in German hands or too damaged to use. Almost everything the advancing armies needed had to come in across the invasion beaches and through the single port of Cherbourg, and then travel hundreds of miles forward by road. And the numbers were merciless. A single army division in 1944 needed something like 35 tons of food alone every day just to eat. On top of that came the ammunition, the medical supplies, the spare parts, and above all, the fuel. The advance had rushed so far, so fast, that the armies were running more than 200 days ahead of where the planners had expected them to be. Every success on the map made the problem behind the lines worse, because the front kept getting farther and farther from the beaches where the supplies came ashore. There was only one way to move it: trucks. And the appetite of a modern mechanized army for fuel is almost impossible to imagine. On an average day, Patton's Third Army and the First Army beside it burned through around 800,000 gallons of gasoline. Soon, Patton's tanks were doing exactly what the Germans had never managed to make them do. They were stopping. Not from enemy fire, but from empty tanks. Patton is said to have raged that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. Every general knows that battles mean nothing if the fuel does not arrive. The Allied advance depended on keeping supplies moving fast enough to reach the tanks, and the Army gave that crucial job to the very men it had judged unfit to fight. This was a segregated army, built on a belief that ran from top to bottom, that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the skill to serve in combat. Because of that belief, black troops were channeled almost entirely into service and supply roles, into the parts of the army that carried, loaded, built, and hauled, rather than the parts that fought. They wore the uniform, they took the risks, but they were kept away from the front line by policy. It was not that these men had chosen to stay out of the fighting. Many of them wanted nothing more than the chance to prove themselves in combat, and were denied it, handed a steering wheel instead of a rifle because of the color of their skin. And so, when the Army needed a massive force of drivers to save its advance, the men who filled that force were overwhelmingly black. Of all the drivers of the Red Ball Express, close to 3/4 were African American. The same army that said these men could not be trusted with a rifle now placed in their hands, the lifeline of the entire war in Europe. The contradiction was total, and the men driving those trucks understood it perfectly. They knew that the fuel in their tanks was worth more to the generals than they themselves would ever be allowed to be. The system itself was born in a frantic rush. In late August of 1944, with the tanks running dry, American commanders locked themselves in a planning session that ran for something like a day and a half straight, and out of it came the Red Ball Express. The larger idea came from General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander himself, drawing on an older model, and it was implemented by the officers beneath him. The name came from an old railroad term. To red ball a shipment meant to send it express, as high priority freight, and railmen had marked those priority cars with a red dot. Now the trucks in the route were marked the same way, with red balls, and the roads they used were closed to civilian traffic and given priority over everything else. The general who put the system into operation gave it a mission statement that said everything about the stakes. Let it never be said, he declared, that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans could not. The route ran from the Normandy region hundreds of miles forward to the supply dumps near the front, stretching in time to nearly 400 miles to reach the First Army and around 350 to reach Patton's Third. A single loaded round trip could take more than 50 hours. To keep it moving, the Army seized two parallel highways and made them one-way. On the northern road, loaded trucks raced toward the front. On the southern road, empty trucks streamed back to be loaded again. A giant, endless loop that never stopped turning, day or night. The scale of it was staggering. At its peak, the Red Ball Express had nearly 6,000 vehicles running on its route, most of them the sturdy 2.5-ton trucks the soldiers nicknamed the Jimmy. On a single day, that fleet could carry around 12,000 tons of supplies forward to the fighting. At any given moment, day and night, hundreds of loaded trucks were on the road, a river of engines and fuel and ammunition flowing toward the front that never, ever stopped. Photographs from those months show convoys stretching from one horizon to the other, an unbroken chain of trucks disappearing into the distance, each one loaded to the roof, and each one driven by a man who had likely not had a real night's sleep in days. It was, in its way, one of the great feats of organization of the entire war. Not a battle, but a machine, a living system of thousands of men and thousands of engines, all moving in one direction with a single purpose. Keep the supplies moving. Keep the tanks fed. Do not let the advance die for want of gasoline. But the numbers hide the human cost. To understand the Red Ball Express, step into the cab with a driver who has not slept in 2 days. The defining enemy of the Red Ball driver was not the German army. It was exhaustion. These men drove around the clock in shifts that stretched far beyond anything that was safe. One trucker remembered the order simply. General Patton, he said, wanted them to eat, sleep, and drive, but mostly to drive. A single round trip on the route could take more than 50 hours, days, and nights blurred together into one long grind. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Trucks drifted off roads. Men splashed water on their faces and kept going because there was no one to replace them and the front could not wait. On paper, the trucks were supposed to hold to a strict speed and stay a set distance apart. But in reality, the drivers tore along as fast as their engines would go, some of them disabling the speed limiters so their trucks could push past 50 miles an hour, anything to shave time off the run, and they often did it in total darkness. To avoid being spotted by enemy aircraft, much of the driving was done at night with the headlights switched off, feeling their way down narrow, unfamiliar French country roads and through the tight lanes of blacked-out villages, by moonlight and instinct alone. The roads themselves destroyed the equipment. The trucks were overloaded, stacked far too high, and they broke down constantly. Tires shredded on debris until more than 40,000 of them had been worn out. And everywhere, the mud, thick French mud that swallowed wheels and stranded machines. When a truck finally died, the rule was brutal and simple. Shove it off the road so it would not block the convoy, and the driver would climb aboard the next truck and keep moving. There was even sabotage to watch for. German prisoners of war were sometimes put to work helping service the trucks, checking tire pressure and oil, and some of them were caught deliberately pouring water into the gasoline cans, trying to cripple the very lifeline the drivers were fighting to keep open. And it was not without real danger. German flying bombs, the ones the soldiers called buzz bombs, droned overhead and fell without warning. Convoys were sometimes ambushed, and some drivers had to fight their way through pockets of enemy soldiers to get their cargo through, occasionally needing armored escorts to survive the trip. One young driver named James Ruckert, only 19 years old and thousands of miles from his home in Ohio, remembered it plainly. He saw trucks get blown up. He remembered dead bodies and dead horses lying on the highways after the bombs came down. He was scared, but he did his job and hoped for the best. Being that young and that far from home, he added, anybody would be scared. That was the reality behind the red ball painted on the door. Frightened young men, worn to the bone, driving through the dark toward the sound of the guns, carrying the fuel and the bullets that everyone else's heroism depended on. And here is the thing, it worked. Against the exhaustion, against the breakdowns, against the mud and the darkness and the fear, they did not stop. They kept the war moving. For roughly 83 days, from late August into the middle of November of 1944, the Red Ball Express ran without pause. In that time, its drivers hauled more than 400,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment to the front, supplying some 28 different divisions of the advancing American Army. They kept Patton's tanks rolling. They kept the guns firing. They carried the war all the way to the border of Germany itself. The operation finally wound down in the middle of November, not because it failed, but because it had done its job long enough for the situation to change. The great port of Antwerp was finally opened. Enough of the French railways had been repaired, and fuel pipelines had been pushed forward. The emergency had passed. The men of the Red Ball Express had carried the army on their backs through the most dangerous gap in the entire campaign, and now they could hand the load to others. The men who understood war knew how essential these drivers were. Without the Red Ball Express, the advance across France would have been impossible. So why has almost no one heard of them? Because when the war was over, the men who drove those trucks got no parades. There were no medals for the way they had gone without sleep, no ceremonies for the tonnage they had hauled. They came home to the same segregated country they had left, a country that still would not let them eat at the same counters or live in the same neighborhoods as the white soldiers whose lives their fuel had saved. Some of them had carried the war across an entire continent and came home to be told to step to the back of the bus. And history did to them what the Army had done. It pushed them into the background. In the countless movies and books about the Second World War, the tank battles and the beach landings are told and retold, while the men who made all of it possible, the drivers hauling the gasoline through the dark, are barely a footnote. Logistics is not glamorous. It does not make for a thrilling scene. And the fact that the men doing it were overwhelmingly black in an army and a country determined not to see them only pushed their story further into the shadows. Only in recent years have historians begun to give them their due, to say out loud that logistics decided the campaign and that the backbone of that logistics was tens of thousands of black soldiers the Army had refused to let fight. Modern commanders study the Red Ball Express as a lesson in how supply, not just courage, wins wars. The truth was there all along. It just took the country a very long time to be willing to look at it. The men of the Red Ball Express did not win the battles history remembers. They made those victories possible, driving through exhaustion and danger to keep the fuel moving. They were told they were not good enough to fight, yet they carried the war forward and were nearly forgotten. Subscribe for more stories about the people history left behind.